A thought appears in your mind. I can't do this. Nothing unusual has happened. Thoughts appear constantly. But sometimes a thought doesn't feel like something passing through your mind. It feels true. It becomes part of the way you understand the situation, and sometimes, part of the way you understand yourself. I can't do this. I'm not good enough. Something is going to go wrong. The thought and the person thinking it can seem almost inseparable. But there's another experience most of us have had. For a moment, you notice yourself thinking. Instead of simply experiencing, I can't do this. You recognize? I'm having the thought that I can't do this. The thought hasn't disappeared. Its words haven't even changed. And yet something about the experience has. That raises a fascinating question. What actually happens when we stop automatically identifying with our thoughts? Michael Singer has spent decades writing and speaking about something deceptively simple. There is an inner voice. It comments. It predicts. It remembers. It argues. And you can become aware that it's doing all of those things. Singer approaches that observation largely through philosophy and contemplative experience. But it creates a question that psychology can investigate. If a person becomes aware of a thought as a thought, does anything actually change? Scientists don't need to decide what consciousness ultimately is to study that question. They can ask people about their internal experiences. They can manipulate psychological perspective. They can measure emotional reactions. They can examine how believable a negative thought feels. And they can observe what happens when a person relates differently to the same internal experience. That distinction matters. Science cannot simply declare, "You are not your thoughts." That's a philosophical claim. But it can investigate something measurable. What happens when the relationship between you and a thought changes? And one of the first discoveries begins with something called meta-awareness. Consider these two experiences. First, I can't do this. Now, I'm noticing that I'm thinking I can't do this. The negative thought is still there. The prediction hasn't become positive. Nothing has been replaced. But something has been added. You're now aware that thinking is occurring. Scientists call this meta-awareness, awareness of your own subjective experience. Normally, attention can become absorbed in the content of thought. We're inside the prediction. Inside the memory. Inside the worry. Meta-awareness introduces another layer. Now the mind isn't only producing the thought. There is also awareness of the process of thinking. That may sound like a tiny distinction. But it creates something scientifically important. The thought can begin to be experienced as an interpretation, prediction, or mental event, rather than automatically as an accurate representation of reality. The thought didn't have to change. Perspective did. But scientists discovered that noticing a thought isn't necessarily the end of the process. Imagine noticing the thought. I'm not good enough. You may be completely aware that you're thinking it. And yet, it can still feel deeply connected to who you are. That's why scientists studying a process called decentering make another distinction. It's called disidentification from internal experience. The terminology sounds complicated. The experience isn't. Compare I am a failure with I'm having a thought that says I'm a failure. In the second case, the thought still exists. But the internal experience and the self are no longer being treated as exactly the same thing. That doesn't mean ignoring the thought. It doesn't mean pretending it's false. And it doesn't require replacing it with something positive. It means experiencing a thought as something you're having rather than automatically as something you are. Now the scientific question becomes much more interesting. If that distinction changes, does the effect of the thought change too? This is where the idea becomes experimentally testable. Scientists develop different ways of changing how people experience negative thoughts. Some studies use techniques designed to reduce what psychologists call cognitive fusion, the degree to which thought content dominates experience as though it were literally true. Then scientists measured what happened. Did the thought become less believable? Did it produce less discomfort? Did emotional reactions change? Across experimental work reviewed in the decentering literature, techniques designed to change the relationship to negative self-referential thoughts have reduced measures such as believability and discomfort compared with control conditions. Other experiments approached the question differently. People were asked to remember emotionally difficult experiences while adopting different psychological perspectives. Again, scientists could measure what followed. And that revealed something important. The goal didn't necessarily have to be make the thought disappear. A thought could remain present, while the way a person reacted to it changed. And that led scientists toward a broader model of what was happening. Scientists studying decentering proposed that 3 related processes help explain this change. The first is meta-awareness. You become aware of the internal experience. I'm thinking. The second is disidentification. You stop automatically treating that internal experience as identical with yourself. I'm having this thought. And the third is reduced reactivity. The thought has less automatic influence over what happens next. These processes appear to interact. Meta-awareness may help create the distinction between the person observing an experience and the experience being observed. That disidentification may then reduce how strongly the content of the thought influences emotion, motivation, or behavior. And reduced reactivity may make it easier to continue observing the thought without immediately becoming absorbed in it again. The thought hasn't necessarily vanished. The mind hasn't become silent. Something subtler has happened. The thought can remain. The response can change. Scientists found another way to investigate the same larger mystery. It's called self-distancing. Imagine remembering an argument that made you angry. You can mentally return to it from an immersed perspective, almost experiencing the event again through your own eyes. Or you can examine the same event from a more psychologically distant perspective, as though observing the situation from farther away. Scientists have experimentally compared these approaches. Across studies, people adopting a more self-distanced perspective while examining negative autobiographical memories showed reductions in aspects of emotional reactivity compared with people remaining immersed in the experience. Some experiments also detected physiological differences, including changes in cardiovascular responses and recovery. Again, the event didn't change. The memory didn't have to disappear. What scientists changed was perspective. And changing perspective changed aspects of the response. That raises another question. If the psychological experience changes, can we see differences in how the brain processes it? Scientists have used brain imaging to investigate psychological distancing and related forms of emotion regulation. The results don't point to one single observer center in the brain. Instead, distancing appears to involve interactions among systems involved in cognitive control, self-related processing, perspective, and emotional responding. That makes sense. To change perspective, the brain has to maintain a different way of representing the experience. Attention has to be directed differently. Self-relevant information has to be processed differently. And emotional responses may be regulated differently. So changing your relationship to an experience isn't merely a poetic description. It corresponds with measurable psychological, and in some studies neural, differences. But this is also where we need to be especially careful. Because brain activity can tell scientists something about how perspective is being processed. It cannot answer the deepest philosophical question Singer began with. And knowing where that boundary lies may be one of the most important parts of this investigation. It's tempting to take these findings one step further. If you can observe a thought, perhaps science has proven that you are not your thoughts. But it hasn't. A psychological experiment can measure changes in attention, emotion, behavior, or physiological response. A brain scan can identify activity associated with changing perspective. Neither can establish what the self ultimately is. That remains a philosophical, and perhaps contemplative, question. Science can make a narrower claim. And in many ways, it's a more useful one. People can experience thoughts from different psychological perspectives. They can become aware of thinking itself. They can experience internal events with less identification. And those changes can alter aspects of the reaction produced by those experiences. We don't need to settle the nature of consciousness to learn something important from that. Because now we can return to the thought that started our investigation. I can't do this. The thought appears again. I can't do this. Maybe it has appeared hundreds of times before. And perhaps it will appear again tomorrow. But now there is another possibility. Instead of immediately entering the thought, you notice it. I'm thinking that I can't do this. The thought becomes an internal event you're experiencing. Not necessarily a fact. Not automatically a definition of who you are. And that distinction can affect how strongly the thought influences the emotional and behavioral processes that follow. This doesn't mean thoughts don't matter. They do. And it doesn't mean every difficult thought becomes harmless simply because we notice it. But decades of psychological research have revealed something much more interesting than the promise of a silent mind. The thought doesn't always have to disappear for its effect on you to change. Sometimes the change isn't in the words appearing in your mind. It's in the relationship you develop with them. And perhaps that's the most useful scientific answer to the question we began with. You don't always have to change the thought to change how strongly it affects you.